Hello, listeners and fellow book lovers. Welcome to the Book Snug, a bi-weekly conversational podcast about books and the reading life. My name is Julia.
And I'm Stephany.
And we're a mother and daughter who love reading and talking about books. The ones we adore and the ones we don't. We're delighted you're here, so grab your favorite hot drink or ice-cold beverage and settle in for another cozy, bookish chat.
Hi, Julia.
Hi, Mom.
And hello, listeners.
Hi, friends.
Thanks for joining us today in the Book Snug, where we will be talking about some of our best and most interesting books of the first quarter of 2023. Mm-hmm. How are you today, Julia?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
What do you have there in your mug?
I am drinking a tea that I've talked about before. It's Plurked, which you can find on Etsy. This is their blossom tea. It's a nice, light, white spring tea. So
perfect tea to be drinking this time of year.
Yeah. When I woke up this morning, it was rainy, the spring rain with all the birds chirping, and I just felt like I needed something light and springy.
Yeah.
So
sounds appropriate.
Yeah. What are you drinking in your mug, Mom?
I am drinking just straight up green tea, Stash's premium green tea, which I think has the best flavor. It's my medicine. I know green tea is good for you, the antioxidants. So this is my medicinal tea for today.
So like when I'm drinking my ginger and turmeric tea, this is your version.
That's my version.
Got it.
Well, I thought before we jumped into our specific books that we want to bring to the show today, that we could just talk generally about our reading for the first quarter, how we're feeling about it, some of our best reading experiences, things like that, if we're meeting our goals. So to start, Julia, how are you feeling about your reading from this winter? And I'm using the term winter to mean January, February, and March mostly.
Yes, I think in general, it's been consistent reading. So though I've had books that have not been great, or I've had several DNFs, or I even had a period of time of beginning to recognize I was feeling burnt out, all of that has still kept me pretty consistent reading. I'm still reading several times a week, still moving through my seasonal TBR list pretty quickly. So very, very consistent.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like it's pretty satisfying that way too, that you're reading the way you wanted to be reading.
Yes, definitely. How would you kind of talk about your reading this winter?
It's been pretty good. Yeah. I started off in January feeling very motivated to read. Mm-hmm. I had a good reading month in January. February was a little bit rougher for me. I chose February to read The Count of Monte Cristo. And that took me about 3 weeks. So I felt like I was kind of bogging down in February, and then March picked right back up again.
Okay.
So overall, I feel very good about my reading. I've been doing a pretty good job of picking books that I think I will like and I end up liking. I have only DNF'd one book so far this year, and that was not a DNF because I wasn't liking the book. It was simply because the book itself was not delivering on what it was marketed as.
Right.
So we separated ways amicably. It was not a I hate you and I don't ever want to see you again type of book. But other than that, been a very good reading time so far.
Good.
Are you meeting your goals? Do you feel like the goals, quote unquote, that we talked about earlier in an earlier episode, do you feel like you are meeting those goals, those desires for your reading life?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I am still definitely reading from my shelf. I think 90 to 95% of the books that I've pulled from my seasonal TBRs are books that I already had. There have been a few books that I've purchased this year. One book I purchased and knew better to not get it, and I got it anyway, and it turned into a DNF. But I definitely think in general, I'm sticking to my goals. Mm-hmm. Where do you fall on that?
I feel like I am definitely meeting my goals as far as reading goes. I made a book number goal on Goodreads. Goodreads always offers a reading challenge every year. You can pick the number of books you want to read, and then it tracks it with a bar, and it tells you where you are in relationship to your reading goal, if you're on target, if you're too slow, if you're reading more. And I picked my reading goal as 65 books, and I am currently 9 books ahead of my reading goal. So I'm really winning there.
Yeah.
I did read The Count of Monte Cristo, which was a specific book goal that I wanted to accomplish this year, and I did that in February, and I'm very proud of that because that is a big book. Over 1,200 pages. Yes. Very dense.
Yes.
And then my only other goal was to read 2 fiction books and 1 nonfiction book from my unread owned bookshelves every month. And I am doing that. And I decided I was going to use the prompts from the website, The Unread Shelf, the monthly prompts to help me pick my books. And I've been doing that as well. So I definitely am just chugging right along with all of the personal goals. I don't want to use goals, but I guess that's the word I should be using.
Yeah. I can't think
intentions
Right.
I set for myself for this year.
Sure.
And I feel good about that.
Good.
I can say that the nonfiction book I picked for March, I ended up not finishing yet because when I started reading it, I realized that it was more appropriate to read it slowly, like a chapter a day.
Oh, sure.
So it's taking me longer than I thought it would, but I'm counting it as my March nonfiction read.
Yeah. Got it.
Since we're talking about what we've been reading, how many books have you read so far this year?
I think I'm somewhere between 13 and 15 simply because I need to go back and do a recount. And that number does include 1 graphic novel, 1 audiobook that I'm in the middle of listening to, and then 2 DNFs. And I include my DNFs because I have read some of the book. So it gives me a better idea of how many books I actually opened up to start reading this year.
Are you ahead this year? Are you further ahead this year than you were last year at this time with reading? Do you feel like you're picking up more books and reading them this year than you did last year?
I mean, last year, because I read less books in total, without doing the math, I don't know where I'm at pacing wise. But I can say that looking at my actual journal, I think I only read 2 books by the end of February last year. And I can tell you I did not read 10 in March.
Yeah.
So just in that context, I'm ahead.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like you're on target to read many more books this year than you did last year.
And I do have to be very, and I think I said this in the last episode. No, I didn't say it before, that I've had to be mindful of the fact of not over-reading, that I lose track of the stories I've just finished, but also not slowing down too much that I lose my momentum of reading in general. So in January, I think I hit the ground running a little too fast. February, I slowed down significantly. And now in March, I'm finding my actual footing for the year.
So you feel like you're finally getting to your sweet spot as far as reading pace.
I think so.
And when I say reading pace, I don't mean how fast you read words on a page. I mean just how fast you're picking up books and getting through them and then picking up the next book.
Right. And I've never been somebody really who I will finish one book and automatically in the next 10 minutes pick up another one. I generally let some time go. But I think I have figured out what that needs to look like for me a little bit more since I'm reading more books than I have. Which has been interesting. I did not expect that little revelation.
Yeah.
So
do you find that you're doing pretty well with sticking to your seasonal TBRs and reading from your shelf? Or you said you bought a book kind of off the cuff and it ended up being a bad decision. Do you find yourself doing that more? Or are you pretty much sticking with your seasonal TBRs and being satisfied with that?
I would say that my seasonal TBRs are the parameters that I've set for myself. They're the fences that I'm operating within. So I am reading from them.
Right.
But if I happen to go to Barnes & Noble with a gift card and I find a book that I've been looking at for a while,
right,
and I get it, that's fine because I'm still reading within everything else. And the book that I did purchase was one of those books that I'd been looking at for a while and happened to see it at Target at a discounted price. Now that's a whole other conversation, that book and I, because it did turn into a DNF.
Right.
But in general, I'm reading what I have.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I find I didn't make any goals about not purchasing books. And I find that I'm still buying a lot of books, but I am definitely reading from my shelves much more this year, I think, purposefully than I did last year.
Sure.
It has caused me a little bit of a problem here towards the end of March, just because I'm feeling like whenever I finish a book and I'm looking for a new book to read and I'm forcing myself to go back to my unread books that I own, I'm looking at the same lists over and over again, and I'm starting to feel uninspired.
Sure.
So I do feel like here at the end of March, beginning of April, I'm not in a slump because I'm still reading books, but I'm really struggling with deciding what am I going to read next. So I think I'm going to allow myself a couple trips to the library and do some book borrowing, not necessarily any more book buying, and see if I can just add some I don't know, energy, some interest into the book list that I'm looking at.
Yeah, sure.
Do you have any favorite reading experiences from the quarter that you want to share? And these don't have to just necessarily be a book, but maybe a book plus, like other things related to the book that were just really good for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think our most recent episode with Nana is definitely one of my favorites. I think it was an incredible experience to be able to take a book that I had read and missed a lot of stuff in it just because of how I was reading it. And then to have this conversation where I got a lot more out of it. It was really, really cool. And I really loved that with Nana, and I'm really excited to see the upcoming conversations that we have with guests then as well. I think that'll be so much fun. Yeah,
with other book friends and family. Yeah. I have to say that was probably my most memorable reading experience of 2023 so far. I loved it. I mean, I love you. I love my mom. I love talking about books, and the marriage portrait was certainly discussable.
Yes.
So it was a great experience for me. And I hope listeners who enjoyed that or listened to that episode enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed doing it.
And I would love to know if anybody who listened to that episode picked up something that they didn't in their read, or vice versa. Did they pick up something that we didn't talk about?
Or were they not going to read the marriage portrait, and after they heard our discussion, they were interested in picking it up and reading it?
Well, I hope we didn't ruin any spoilers for them if that was the case.
Well, some people like to know what they're getting into, so
that's
maybe
true.
it wasn't too bad.
That's true.
Yeah. Any other favorite or memorable reading experiences?
Yeah, I will say this here. What has been really fun for me as we have been getting more comfortable with the podcast is when I'm in conversations with people. And it's generally been with complete strangers, which is very out of character for me. But if I've been having a conversation with somebody about books, either because I'm wearing my bookworm sweatshirt or something, and a conversation has been happening about, would you like to read whatever, to be able to mention the podcast.
Yes.
Which has been so fun to then see people's reactions of, oh, well, I love to read. I will totally look up the podcast now. I had that interaction when I was getting cookies, of all things, a couple of weeks ago. And then I was at a craft fair over the weekend, and a friend of mine is absolutely fabulous. And she just started telling random strangers about the podcast as we were doing our things. But it's just been really cool to share this with people in that way too.
Yeah, that's great. And certainly for me too, I've had a lot of fun just watching the statistics for the podcast. Yeah. And what I really want to see happen soon is a way for us to connect better with people who are listening to us, that we can have conversations, like active in real time conversations about what we're talking about or what people are reading. And so listeners, we're definitely hoping to get some kind of platform set up that we are able to do that in a better manner than trying to do it through Facebook or on Instagram. But yeah, definitely the podcast has been a good reading experience, a memorable one for us.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think Nana's episode is the most popular so far.
Just about, yeah. And then just one final memorable reading experience for me has been the experience of reading The Count of Monte Cristo. And I am going to talk about that book a little bit later here in the show. But it took a long time. It was very dense. It really made me think about morality and what is good and what is bad and who determines it and how justice is meted out. So it was a very memorable reading experience. Not always good or
Sure.
fun, but
Right.
definitely memorable.
When was that book written in comparison to Les Miserables? Because it sounds like they're very similar themes.
Mid-1800s.
Okay. So they're probably very similar.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I'd be curious if one
And they're
inspired the
both
other.
French. They're
Oh,
both
yeah.
French, so they probably have a lot of the same sensibilities.
Yeah. I would have to dig into that a little bit.
I do know the Count of Monte Cristo is about the end of Napoleon.
Okay.
So is it earlier or is it later than Les Mis?
Les Mis is after Napoleon.
Okay.
Because they talk about at one point the battles of Waterloo, which would have been
before. Okay.
Yeah.
So the Count of Monte Cristo then time-wise is probably before Les Mis, but they are both French. So they would have a lot of the same sensibilities and they probably would bring a lot of the same like cultural perspective as far as what is interesting the people at the time and what type of stories they want to be reading.
Yeah.
Okay, well, without further ado, let's jump into our books of the first quarter of 2023, which would be January, February, March. Now, there is no way that we can talk about every book that we read. We can't even really talk about all of the great books we read. So in order to keep our podcast basically within the time frame that we try, we're so bad at this.
No.
We came up with 4 categories and we are going to pick a book for each category. The first category is Cream of the Crop, which is exactly as it sounds. It's best of the best. It may not be the very best book we read for the quarter, but it is a best book of the quarter. The second category is the sleeper hit. And this is a book that ended up being better than we thought it was going to be. It's a happy surprise. Either we weren't expecting much and it over-delivered, or we were expecting it to be great and it ended up being fantastic. It blew our socks off. The third category is the letdown. And this is a book that disappointed us. Again, this may not be the worst book we read. It's just the book that we had expectations for that absolutely were not met. And then our final category is the wild card. And this is the category that allows us to pick any other book out of all the books we read in the first quarter that we want to talk about today. So it can be another really baddie book. It can be another fabulous book, or it can be another unique or weird book, whatever we want to do. Okay. Are you ready for this, Julia?
Let's dive right in.
Okay. What is your cream of the crop book?
My cream of the crop, the one that has made me very, very happy, Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. I loved this book.
So did I.
So just a little synopsis here. This is set in Regency, England. And it's in an England where there's fae and fairies, courtly fae. Like when we're talking about fairies, we mean the traditional, the folklore, the
fairies based in folklore.
Right.
Yeah.
Not the fairies that we see in like Sleeping Beauty. Like very different kind of
Right. Or in the YA fantasy romances where all the fairies are beautiful and this is not that.
Right. Right. So the main character, her name is Dora. She is, I think cursed is probably the best way to put it. Cursed with half a soul. Essentially, there was a bargain on her life where a Fae Lord was going to take her soul, and he got interrupted in the process, and she is left with half of her soul. The Fae Lord ended up with her emotional sensing side of things.
Feeling side.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then Dora is left with her practical, logical
Thinking
side.
side.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the story is taking place during the courting season in specifically London.
Yes.
And Dora is not treated very nicely because she is considered half of a person.
Weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But she has a beautiful cousin, Vanessa, who is fawned over and loved over. And Vanessa gets it into her mind to convince the Lord Sorcier, who is the magician in the court, to help put Dora back together again. And so ensues this romantic, sweet fairy tale romance, along with the antics that come with Dora not having great social sensibilities. She ends up in several very awkward situations. where she clearly says, oh, I should not have said that, or I should not do this.
But she doesn't recognize it till after it's over.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I enjoyed every step of this story. When I want spring reading, and this was what it was, this was the start of my spring reading, I want Regency England and light fantasy and romance and all things sweet and flowery and
light.
Right.
Yeah.
This was all of that.
Yep.
Adora made me laugh out loud. I saw some of myself in her. Just a very easy character to get behind. The romance was sweet, not subtle, but soft.
Mm-hmm.
And you rooted for every character except the Fae Lord. He could.
He was the bad guy.
Yeah. Yeah. But just a highly, highly enjoyable story to read.
I agree. 100%. Very entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
Back at 100%. And it does sound like it's the type of book that ticks all your boxes for spring.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can't recommend this enough. If you're in a reading rut, or if you're looking for a good fairy tale that's a closed door romance, or whatever, I highly recommend it.
Yeah. And I don't know if we've talked about open and closed door before.
Not yet.
On here. But when we say closed door,
we mean Jane Austen, not 50 Shades of Grey.
Thanks for stepping in,
yes.
Julia. Yeah. Closed door means there's no sexy time in the bedroom that you are being exposed to. Everything there could be things happening. It's happening off page.
Sure.
You're not getting any descriptions. Open door is spicy.
Mm-hmm.
An open door can be just a little bit opened, or it can be thrown open and the whole world is seeing what's going on. So
this is the kind of book that I'm totally okay to read in public.
Closed door.
Right.
There's no blushing.
Nope.
And
Nope. Not hiding what I'm
embarrassment.
reading.
Right. Okay. Well, my cream of the crop book is kind of along the same lines as the book that you brought. Mm-hmm. It is a romantic fantasy. It's also a historical. And there is a very slow burn, closed door relationship going on. And the book I want to talk about is Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries. Mm-hmm. I listened to this book on audio, and I think that is the way to go with this book. It's narrated by Elle Potter and Michael Dodds. You're not going to hear Michael Dodds much. He is reading the voice of the main male protagonist, which is Wendell Bamblebee. And you don't get much of his perspective in the book. And Michael Dodds is only reading his perspective. So it's just a couple cameo appearances. 5-star read for me. Emily Wilde is an expert in fairies, and she is an academic teaching, I think, at Cambridge. I keep forgetting to look up the college. But this is a Cambridge in a alternative England and world in the 1900s that recognizes fairies and teaches about them. And that's what Emily does. And it's her sole focus in her life to create an encyclopedia that catalogs every fairy known in the world. She is an introvert. She is antisocial. She is very focused on the work she does. And she struggles with interactions with other people. So that comes into play in the story. And the story begins when she is on her way to do an expedition in a Scandinavian country in a small town called Hransvik. I think that's how you say the name. It's cold, it's snowy, it's icy. So this is a great book for me to read in the winter because I love to read about cold, snowy places in the wintertime. She gets there, and of course, she hasn't done any research in the customs or the culture of the country, and she very quickly offends and alienates every single person who could possibly help her make her expedition successful. So she finds herself in a cold, damp cottage with no food, no way to make a fire, and she's really struggling. And her world-renowned, very charming, very handsome colleague shows up, and his name is Wendell Bamblebee. And he, of course, charms the entire village. Everybody can't wait to help him and make him comfortable. And he ends up helping Emily in the same way. And then he does help her with her expedition. Bamblebee has some secrets of his own that Emily has pretty much figured out already, but they come to light in the story. And the plot goes from there. Character driven, definitely.
Yeah.
It's a slow moving story, so don't approach this book expecting there to be a crazy fast plot with lots of action. There are things that happen, but it's not fast paced by any means. You're dealing with real fae. These are not stylized, romanticized fae. They are tricksters. They make bargains that can sometimes hurt humans. They don't understand human beings very well. They're very self-focused and selfish. There is a changeling in this story who is kind of nasty. And some of the situations are pretty high stakes. There are some kind of ugly scenes too in this book, where there's some death. So I would not call this a cozy fantasy, but it is definitely a relaxed and charming fantasy. That's the direction I would go. The reason I love this book is I love the characters, all of them, not just the two main characters of Emily and Wendell, Bamblebee, but the villagers and some of the fae. So love that. Love the world building, and the atmosphere was fantastic. Love the fantastical elements. The author brings in a lot of real folklore surrounding fairies and stories about fairies into the book. So that was nice to read that. The slow burn romance is great. Love a slow burn romance. The slower the better as far as I'm concerned. I love pining. I love the will they, won't they. So that was good. It's very funny. I laughed a couple times out loud, heartwarming, and it's great on audiobook. Recommend it on audiobook. The other thing I will say is I can offer a comparison book to this one. If anyone has read the memoirs of Lady Trent by Marie Brennan, that book has the same feel, the same vibe as this book. Lady Trent is in the same basic time period in England, a place like England, but she is chasing dragons and Emily Wilde is chasing fairies, really. They both suffer from the prejudices and the discrimination against women of that time, the mid to late 1800s. So they have the same type of feel, but I enjoyed them both. I think I like Emily Wilde's definitely better, but they're both good and they both have the same type of feel. So highly recommend. Thought it was a great time. I recommend you read this in winter just because of the setting, but it would also work in the spring. So Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett.
Yeah.
5-star read.
And I'm listening to this and I'm enjoying every second of it.
Yeah.
It's another one where I've laughed out loud. And books don't make me do that very often. It takes a really good, funny book to make me laugh. And Emily Wilde's has got me on a couple occasions.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. What's your sleeper hit for the first quarter, Julia?
My sleeper hit is The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. And we have definitely talked about this before. But just a brief synopsis here. This is a narrative nonfiction. So the things in this story actually take place. These are things that you can research, that you can find all of the information about.
And photos.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The Devil in the White City, it's a split story. And one of the stories follows Daniel Burnham, who is elected to be the main architect or the
designer.
Yeah, the designing architect behind the Chicago World Fair in 1893. And it is the buildup of when they're getting the approval for this, the 3 years that they have to make this fair happen, and then through to the end of the fair. And then the second story is the story of H.H. Holmes, who is in Chicago at the same time and goes on to be America's first serial killer, using the publicity of the fair to his gruesome advantage. So these stories kind of go back and forth throughout the book. And Erik Larson has this chock full of journal entries and information. He has pages upon pages of citations at the back, which for me is really important to know that this is actual stuff that he's pulling from. I couldn't put this book down, and which is so odd to me because I don't really read nonfiction,
right? And
which is why it stands out to me as such a sleeper hit, because I was interested in it enough to even put it on my list to read it and to do that. But this was great.
Mm-hmm.
I have read, I'm not entirely sure how true it is, I've read that there's an HBO series of this that's supposed to be coming out next year.
Okay.
When it is, I will be getting HBO and I will be watching this series. Very good. Now, I will say that there are gruesome details towards the end of the story as the crimes are coming to light.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not gruesome for gruesome's sake, but gruesome because of the
nature
details that
of
are
what's going on
present. Yeah. And I normally am okay with things like that, but they involved children at one point, so they're just a little touchy.
So just a heads up.
Yeah. But this was great for me to read in the winter. And then it was a great pre-read for The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, because the fair is mentioned in The Night Circus.
Yeah. And you just mentioned you couldn't put it down.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that is an excellent description of what really good narrative nonfiction is. It is like reading a novel that you are just totally engrossed in.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I didn't know much of this time in history. I had heard of the Chicago Fair before. I knew that Thomas Edison and a couple other really prominent people were present at the fair, but I didn't really know what it was. And so it was really cool to learn this information, to learn that this is where the Ferris wheel was introduced, to learn about so many other things that were introduced at this fair, and then to also learn that there's not a single remnant of the fair that's still present in Chicago today.
Right. It's mostly gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So really fascinating event in history.
Well, my sleeper hit is also a nonfiction book. I think that's interesting that we both picked nonfiction books.
It is.
I picked Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing. I did listen to this. This was another audiobook, and Simon Prebble narrated this. This book is about an expedition that was overseen by Ernest Shackleton, and I think it's 26 other men. I think the total crew was 27.
Okay.
They sailed to Antarctica with the plan to traverse Antarctica from one side to the other. Another crew was going to meet them on the other side and then take them home. But they got stuck in ice early on in the trip. And for 2 years, they tried to get home. So this is a story of 2 years of surviving in Antarctica. And it was incredible.
Wow.
Now, I will say that I listened to this, and I feel like listening to it is probably the best way to go. I recommended this book to Nana, to my mom, to read, and she read it in the physical copy, and she said it was a little bit dry for her. So I'm saying that I loved this book, but I think I loved it because it was on audio.
Sure.
But it was a compelling tale, like you, Julia. I couldn't put it down. I just had to know what happened to these men. Now, it is a historical occurrence. You can look it up. It's known that everybody survives. I think that's what helped me get through, because if I had started reading this and not known the outcome, it would have been extremely difficult.
Oh yeah.
It's just so compelling. And at one point, I remember telling my husband Jay that I was just so tired of being cold and wet, and I didn't want to eat any more seal meat. I just wanted to be out of Antarctica. And I can't. That's what the men felt too, of course. So. But I was just very there in the environment, experiencing what the men were experiencing. I was so impressed with Shackleton's leadership and the way the men respected him. I was impressed with the men's camaraderie. And I think those two things, the respect for leadership and the fact that the men cared about each other, is why they did all survive in the end.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
I also think that this trip, and I'm coming from a Christian perspective, it was hard not to read about the men's experience and not see God's hand like working through this horrible situation and bringing these men home. It was moving. They accomplished things that most people could never survive, and everybody survived. Only I think one man lost his foot, and that's about it. Everybody else survived intact. Wow. Yes. Incredible story. Absolutely incredible. Highly recommend on audio. I'm glad it wasn't me. That's all I have to say.
Me too.
And like you, Julia, what really made this good is that Alfred Lansing pulled a lot of journal entries and ship's records and added them to the story. So you were getting individual men's experiences, their thoughts in the suffering and the trials, and it was just really good.
Yeah, it's not a book that I think I'm gonna pick up. I think I did my literary nonfiction for the 5 years. I'll try again in a couple more.
The other thing I will say, this is a cold book, cold and snowy. If you're the type of person who likes to read cold in the winter like I do, this was perfect.
Okay.
And it kind of satisfied my snow need, this and Emily Wilde, because we didn't get any snow this year.
No.
So.
Although, when I was in New York this past weekend, I saw snow.
Did you really?
There was snow on the ground. So they must have got it at some point and it was still trying to melt. Yeah. It was very exciting to see that.
All right. Next up, what's your letdown?
My letdown, so the one that did not meet my expectations. And I'm sorry to all of her fans that might be listening, but Erin Morgenstern is hitting my list a couple of times in this episode. The one I want to talk about here is the Starless Sea. I don't know how to give a synopsis on this story. I think simply it is the story of an underground reading place, the harbor on the Starless Sea. And there's some sort of secret society that was in place at one point around this. And then there's a very loose quest at the end of the book.
Okay.
That's my best shot.
I haven't read this book, so I can't even help you out here.
Yeah. And I know that Erin Morgenstern writes stories that are loose plots to begin with.
Yeah.
And that she experiments with literary techniques and storytelling and all of that.
Cares very much about atmosphere and setting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So going into this story, having had read The Night Circus, I was not expecting it to be a book with high propulsion to it. I was expecting it to be some kind of sit down and mull over kind of a story. However, for me, the second half of the book began to just feel disjointed, and that one chapter didn't relate to the other, and that I lost the plot, essentially is what happened. I didn't know what was going on anymore. In The Night Circus, which I will talk about in a second, the way that she alluded to ideas or she alluded to things, you understood what was going on. That was happening in this book, but I didn't know what she was alluding to, so I often felt behind.
Adrift, yeah.
I would kind of compare this book, at least the second half of the book, to Neil Gaiman, specifically Ocean at the End of the Lane.
Okay.
In that feeling kind of like the imagination took over, or the creativity took over. So now I didn't know what was going on anymore.
Right.
And that's not a jab at Neil Gaiman. I just am looking at their literary styles.
Yeah.
I do want to point out, though, this is a place, so the harbor on the Starless Sea, which is this place, this reading haven, that is going the way of Narnia for me, that I would love to have visited. I would have loved to have seen it in its glory. It would be an incredible place. And I think that in this book specifically, Erin Morgenstern does a great job of layering storytelling. So there's lots of stories happening at the same time that lay up together really, really nicely. But I would have liked to have seen the story go in a much, much different direction than it did.
Right.
So,
okay. Yeah, disappointments are tough.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about probably, this will be one of my biggest disappointments of the year. It's certainly my biggest disappointment so far this year, because I couldn't wait to read this book, and then it really fell flat. And I am talking about The Light Pirate by Lily Brooks-Dalton. I gave it 3 stars, so it's not an awful book, but I was expecting it to be easily 5 stars. I read Lily Brooks-Dalton's Good Morning Midnight, and I loved that book. So I was extremely disappointed in this book. It's the story of a young girl named Wanda who is born during a horrendous hurricane in Florida. And then the story is just her life. But the background of this book is an apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic like climate event that's going on in the world. And we are specifically based in Florida.
Okay.
So Florida is having these super storm hurricanes. It's submerged in water. We're watching civilization just like crumble throughout Wanda's life. And whole story has been compared often to Where the Crawdads Sing.
Okay.
By, help me out, Julia. Delia Owens. And the reason there's the comparison is both books have this very young girl who is growing up and trying to survive in really difficult circumstances.
Sure.
In The Light Pirate, Wanda is never really by herself like Kaya is in Where the Crawdads Sing. And the actual storylines are totally different.
Sure.
But it's just that concept of being in a wilderness, this young girl trying to survive. The first half of the book was really, really good. One of Lily Brooks-Dalton's definite talents is creating this environment, this atmosphere. So you were in the hurricane when Wanda is born is intense. It's tense, it's dangerous, and you are absolutely aware of that. And then as you're starting to watch her grow up in this environment, you're right there with her. The characters that are surrounding her, her father, her brother, the neighbor lady, you buy all of that. But there's a point in this book where it feels like the author loses track of the plot. Like she's not really sure how she wants to wrap up this apocalyptic feel. And the plot gets weird. There are some really weird decisions that the characters make that don't fit with what they've done in the past. There's this weird insta-love thing that happens, which I didn't buy at all. There are some plot points that are never addressed, like they're just left dangling at the end. And then there's this really twee, and I use the word twee to mean like saccharine sweet ending that it's not earned. Like there's nothing in the story, nothing that would make you think that this is how the ending is going to be.
Sure.
So the writing was still excellent, like the actual craft of writing, very good. Really enjoyed the first book, hated the second half of the book. I was bored. That's never good. And then the leaving the plot points dangling and then the ending just, I was so disappointed. So very disappointed.
Yeah.
That was The Light Pirate by Lily Brooks-Dalton.
Yeah. That's sad, man.
Okay, that's Julia, what are we going to do for the wild card? What are you picking?
Erin Morgenstern is coming back up.
Okay. Is it going to be good or bad?
Well, bittersweet.
Okay.
I think I'll put it that way.
Well, what did you rate the book?
Yes. So this is The Night Circus before I get too far.
Oh, yeah. We didn't even mention it, did we?
This is The Night Circus. I rated it about 4-ish.
Out of 5 stars.
Yeah.
Okay. So really not bad in the grand scheme of things.
No. And there's a larger kind of conversation that I'll have in a second. If you have not read The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, kind of like what I said for The Starless Seas, it has a loose plot.
Loose, yeah.
I would even go so far as to say a soft plot.
Or minimal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a magical story.
All about the vibes.
Yes. Oh, my word. It is a magical, decadent circus in the mid-1800s in England, Victorian era. And it kind of comes out of a magical competition between the main characters, Marco and Celia, who are set as each other's competitors without their consent.
Right.
It was something that was put into motion before either one of them had any knowledge that that's what was going on. And then they come to find out that this competition has rather high stakes, where whoever wins, the other one will
die.
Yeah.
Cease to exist.
Yes. But the circus itself, the details in the circus are going the same way as the Starless Sea, as Narnia, as the Polar Express.
So cool.
Yes.
Oh, so cool.
I would love to have wandered around that.
Yeah.
If anybody ever develops the technology to get us into fictional worlds, I'm going. Bye.
I always thought that too. I think I wrote a blog post one time about fictional worlds I'd like to visit, and I definitely put the Night Circus on there.
Yes. Having had read The Devil in the White City, of them walking around the Chicago Fair in the evening, tied so nicely into moving into the circus, which only happens at night. It is a night circus on purpose.
Yes.
And so I would have been there like for hours and hours and hours on end.
Yeah.
Not sleeping, not getting anything done that I needed to do, but I would have been at the circus. So I enjoyed the atmosphere immensely. But this book went the way of being read at the wrong time.
Okay.
In the middle of January, my husband and I had to put our sweet kitty down after she had gotten sick very, very fast.
Yeah.
And grief is a tricky thing because for me, at least, I didn't want to read to distract myself from the grief, but I also didn't want to sit in grief without doing anything about it. Mm-hmm. And I also found myself feeling that everything was pointless and everything was meaningless. And Ben and I carried some trauma over the situation as well because of how intense things had happened. Right. So it was a weird place that we were in at the end of January. So this book was next to read, and I picked it up as a way to convince myself that things were not pointless, they were not meaningless, start slowly. But I think because the plot was so soft, so subtle, so loose, that it created space for my mind to poke at and touch at the grief. Mm-hmm. And the story is, as I was reading it, it has a tragic undertone to it. Yeah. Which was not what I should have been reading. So because I was emotionally, not distracted, I was emotionally engaged elsewhere, mm-hmm. I was not able, I think, to experience the story in the way that maybe it should have been. Yeah. I still think that the story would be great to read around Halloween. Mm-hmm. I think it would make a great movie.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
And I'm biased, and I think it would be great if Tim Burton did it, but I mean, you know.
He'd do a great job.
Yeah, if it went the way of Alice in Wonderland, it would be fabulous. But I am just upset that I didn't get the experience of reading this book that I think it could have been.
So, great book, wrong time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that that's why I had to rate it lower because...
Mm-hmm. And you still gave it a good rating. Yeah. I mean, I would call that still a good rating.
Yeah.
4 out of 5.
Yeah.
4-ish out of 5.
Yeah, 4-ish. Yeah. I did enjoy the story. I think I definitely liked it better than Starless Sea. But I want to come back to this book in maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 years and try reading it again. What is your wild card, Mom?
My wild card is going to be The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Mm-hmm. I did give this book 4.25 stars. Okay. I was expecting to give it 5, but I had a couple of stub my toe things in the book. First of all, I think everybody knows what The Count of Monte Cristo is about, but I'm just going to briefly run through the plot line. Mm-hmm. The plot line for The Count of Monte Cristo is based on the main character's life, Edmond Dantes. And in the beginning of the story, he is this young man who is loving life and things are going very well. He's in love with a beautiful woman. He is very much liked by his employer. He's a sailor and his employer owns a bunch of ships. But there are a couple of men who are either jealous of him, who are greedy, or who are afraid of what Edmond knows and how that might hurt him and his family. And these 3 men, or 4, you could say 4, work together, unknowingly work together to falsely accuse and imprison Edmond for treason. And he ends up spending 14 years of his life in the Chateau d'If. While he's there, he meets Abbe Faria, who gives him a classic education and also tells him about this hidden treasure and tells him how to find it. So something happens, something weird happens, and Edmund is able to escape from the Chateau d'If, and he goes right away to this island called Monte Cristo and finds treasure. And the story goes from there, following Edmund's planned retaliation against the men who have put him in prison for so long.
Okay.
That's the storyline. I think it's common knowledge. There's a movie out there, at least one. I've really enjoyed the first part of this book. Absolutely loved meeting him and the other characters in the book, and then following him through his experience in prison, escaping, and then finding the treasure. Then there's a period of time that elapses, not in the book, but it just happens. And then the next part of the book is Edmund coming back and starting his revenge plan. I did not like Edmund at all at that time in the book. And so in the middle of the book, I really struggled to pick it up because I thought Edmund was arrogant. I thought he was self-righteous. I thought he felt like he was above the human race, that he was given some kind of special license to mete out this justice and this revenge on people from God. He was rude and obnoxious, and I just really, really, really struggled with him. Plus, at this point in the book, a ton of characters come in, and the storylines just seem all over the place. It does make sense because they all come together in the end, but that middle part was very slow for me. Then at the end, it picked back up, and Edmund actually becomes more human because he starts to realize he's making mistakes and people are being hurt or dying because of his revenge, innocent people who had nothing to do with what happened to him. So it was all up and down. It took me 3 weeks and I just felt like I was eating, breathing, sleeping, thinking about the Count of Monte Cristo. So I was a little disappointed that it wasn't a 5-star read, but I'm very glad I read it. Still 4.25 stars, so definitely up there. Going to be probably in some of the best books I read of the year. But it was definitely like a long, drawn out effort to get through the book.
Yeah. My Lame is a 1,700 pages. So yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about.
I've read, I don't have any issues with picking up big books, but it just always feels like they can be a real slog just because of the number of pages. But I appreciate the creativity and the intellect of the writer. I do think he was writing for word count, and that might be why it's so long. But he definitely pulls in like mythological stories, and you definitely get a feel for what people were interested in at the time as far as culture. Like the Europeans were very interested in Middle Eastern culture and religion, and that shows up a lot in the story. And I liked contemplating the idea of justice and revenge and whose job is it, and is it satisfying for humans to enact revenge on people? Is it as satisfying as you think it's going to be? It's very melodramatic. That's one thing that had me rolling my eyeballs occasionally.
Like
I don't do well with melodrama. So that was one, but I understand that is definitely a thing for that time in history. This is middle 1800s. And sensation novels have a lot of melodrama too. Like Wilkie Collins wrote a lot of sensation novels. And even though I like the stories, I can't help it. My eyeballs just roll when we get to the melodrama. So that's where we are with that. But that is my wild card pick for this time around.
Very cool. That was really fun to talk about.
It was
all
fun.
Of these books.
Yeah.
I know that there's tons more that we could talk about.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a DNF that I just want to like.
Maybe we can do an episode where we just talk about recent DNFs.
Yeah, we should.
I need a few more if we're going to do that because I haven't been DNFing. But...
Well, maybe that's a good standard to keep. Like, let's not DNF. But I think at some point we definitely should talk about the ones that we've DNF'd, maybe closer to the end of the year.
Yeah.
But listeners, we'd love to know, if you've read any of these. What are your thoughts? And what are some of the books that you've read this quarter that would fit into these categories?
Yeah, we're always looking for new books to read. So if you have any suggestions from books you've read in January, February, and March that that fit the best, the cream of the crop, or your
wild card.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Big letdown. Tell us about your letdowns.
We probably won't read it, but tell us anyway. We are delighted that you have decided to spend your time with us, listening to us chat and babble about our books. We're very thankful for your listening ear and for your support. We talked about our stats earlier, and we started this as just a fun little hobby.
Yes.
And it's been so fun to see people who routinely come back to hang out with us.
Yes.
Our next chapter is going to be spiritual life books.
Yes. In response to the Easter holiday.
Yes. If that's something that's not your cup of tea, pun intended, catch us the next time.
Yes.
If not, join us then as we kind of take things a little bit slower and maybe on a bit more of a serious note at that point.
And talk about spiritual books of all kinds that have been meaningful to us.
Yes. Running the full gamut. Thank you for spending your time with us. We'll catch you on the next time.
We'd love for you to continue today's conversation with us at the Booksnug_podcast on Instagram and at the Booksnug Podcast on Facebook. All of our episodes can be found wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as at our website, thebooksnugpodcast.budsprout.com, where show notes for every episode can be found. We'd love to hear from you. Email us at thebooksnugpodcast@gmail.com.
As C.S. Lewis, one of our favorite authors, so famously said, "You can never have a cup of tea large enough or a book long enough to suit me," and we wholeheartedly agree.